One of the responsibilities of the National Security Advisor is to advise the president about the intricacies and risks of foreign policy. Well, that's how it works in most administrations anyway. But in the case of the Trump administration, John Bolton's job as National Security Advisor, at least in Trump's mind, was the same as just about everyone else in Trump's circle exposed to the Ukraine scandal. Report to Rudolph Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, in order to pressure Ukraine to dig up dirt on Democrats. Bolton, as we mentioned earlier in the show, had serious concerns about the campaign being run by Giuliani. He reportedly said, quote, Giuliani's a hand grenade who's going to blow everybody up. He then, according to his then aide, Fiona Hill, instructed her to notify the chief lawyer for the National Security Council about what Giuliani was doing. Our next guest would know a thing or two about the inner workings of the National Security Council because she used to have Bolton's job. Susan Rice is the former National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, as well as the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. She has a new memoir out entitled Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. And Ambassador Rice, it's so great to talk with you. Thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be with you, Joy.
So let's first talk about this job that you held, that Mr. Bolton also held. National Security Advisor. We know that when a president makes a call to a foreign leader, there are lots and lots of people on the call. Typically, would the National Security Advisor be one of those people?
Typically, yes. And actually, Joy, they're not lots and lots. They're a handful of National Security Council staffers, usually the National Security Advisor or the Deputy National Security Advisor, somebody like Fiona Hill, who was responsible for the office that was placing the call, and one or two of her staffers, and then a couple or three people who were note-taking in the Situation Room.
And who then would have custody of the transcript of such a call? And I ask you that because we now know from the whistleblower that this particular call to the president of Ukraine, the transcript of it wound up in this super secret classified system where normally highly classified material goes, but this transcript went there. Who would be in charge of putting stuff in that database, in that server?
Well, normally a presidential call, even one that is classified up to the top secret level, would be stored in the normal National Security Council system that cleared staffers who have a need to know would have access to. To move it, as is apparently the case in this instance, to a highly classified, super secret server, which frankly is used for things that we don't talk about on television, is very unusual and arguably inappropriate. The only rational, responsible reason for moving a transcript to that system would be if, in fact, its contents were that super classified, which it's clearly wasn't the case in this instance and rarely, if ever, is the case. So this transcript was moved for some other reason, and it appears to be to hide it from scrutiny.
And we're being very generous in calling it a transcript. I have your book here. We know that it was a transcript sort of summary that was put out by the White House because they thought it was exculpatory, weirdly enough, and now it's what's leading toward his impeachment. You write in the book, in your book, about setting up calls between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, the sort of intricacies of kind of the dance that gets done diplomatically to make a call like that happen. From your standpoint as a former national security advisor, might the other party have taped that call? Or might the Russians, who we know are in conflict with Ukraine and occupying part of Ukraine, is there a chance that there's a real transcript of that call, a full transcript that either the Ukrainians have or the Russians have?
Well, it's possible, certainly, that the Ukrainians have it. It's possible, certainly, that there's a more full verbatim transcript on the U.S. side. I would hope that the Russians wouldn't have it.
Well, I think that's a good hope for everyone. I want to just ask you very quickly before I turn, because I want to talk to you about Turkey as well. What do you make of Donald Trump's attitude toward the Kremlin, toward Vladimir Putin? It seems to be very solicitous. He seems to have lots of secret phone calls with him that aren't detailed even to his own national security staff that we find out later, sometimes from the Russians. What do you make of his attitude toward Russia?
Donald Trump's attitude towards Russia?
Or his relationship with them?
Well, it's bizarre, to say the least. I mean, everything he seems to be doing is geared to benefit the Russians, whether it's denying Ukraine $400 million in badly needed military assistance when the Russians are on their territory and denying the new leader a White House meeting to advance his own personal political interests. That benefits Donald Trump, and that benefits Vladimir Putin. In Syria, we're seeing this impulsive, incredibly dangerous decision to pull our forces out. And again, that benefits, in this case, ISIS, Turkey, and of course, Vladimir Putin. And we could go through a whole range of policy choices that the president has made, from denigrating our allies in NATO to trashing our intelligence community when, standing next to Putin in Helsinki. All of these things make very, very little sense for any normal and patriotic American president.
Do you think that Donald Trump is compromised by Vladimir Putin?
You know what, Joy? I can't point to evidence that would validate that argument. I can only say that it is very strange. It doesn't add up. And I am searching for, as we all should be as Americans, a plausible explanation for Donald Trump's deep affinity for Vladimir Putin to the detriment of our national interest.
And you write in your book about the Russian attitude toward Ukraine and why it is so toxic. The fact that they were concerned and have been concerned that Ukraine would tilt toward the European Union, would tilt toward NATO and tilt away from them, and that is sort of the crux of their problem with Ukraine. Does the fact that Donald Trump, that one of his favors that he wanted from the president of Ukraine was to prove that Russia was essentially innocent, a conspiracy theory that they didn't do it in 2016. What does that say to you? Does it say to you, again, that Donald Trump was attempting to compromise U.S. national security and to corrupt another country to benefit Putin?
Well, what it does say, Joy, is that he was prepared to sacrifice the U.S. national security and our national interest, which is in bolstering Ukraine against Russian aggression, in order to extort out of the Ukrainian president assistance to attack his political adversary, false, bogus assistance. That is problematic. It's not altogether clear why he would want to do that except for personal political gain. The other thing that he was doing on that phone call, where, by the way, he did nothing to advance U.S. policy, was to try to elicit, again, false information from the Ukrainians that would suggest that it was Ukraine and the Democrats that interfered in the 2016 election rather than Russia on behalf of Donald Trump. Again, sanitizes Russia, tars his political adversaries with a complete falsehood that has been repeatedly repudiated by our intelligence community, by bipartisan committees in Congress, and by everybody who knows anything about what happened in 2016.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.